We're ready to get started again. Could everyone please take their seats? All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I am Eric Thronson. I'm a Deputy Director at the California Transportation Commission. I'm pleased to be up here for the City and County Perspectives panel. I'm joined by a few of my good friends here, Chris Lee with the California State Association of Counties, Keith Dunn with the SelfHelp Counties Coalition, and Ronnie Bruegel from the League of California Cities. I'm not going to introduce them any further than that because I think we all know them well enough, and if you want to learn more about them, you could Google them. And their bios are on our website, which would happen if you Googled their names. So, all right, so we'll begin with each of them having a turn to share their perspective on SB1 and the Commission's implementation of the programs therein. I hope they just take a few minutes each so that we can move on to a few questions that I have prepared for them, and I will try not to hurt them too badly with those questions. And so with that, let's begin. I believe we took a pre-poll, and that we will begin with Chris, and then Ronnie will go next, and we will finish with Keith, who will close the show. Chris?
Hi, my name is Chris Lee.
Nope.
See, I'm analog here. I was looking for the button. But Chris Lee, I'm a legislative analyst for the California State Association of Counties. And for those of you who aren't familiar with CSAC, we're essentially the trade association for county supervisors in California. So we're a voluntary association that has all 58 California counties represented on our board of directors and our policy committees. And I work on the Housing, Land Use, and Transportation Policy Committee. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about a interesting and exciting topic, a passage of SB1, and what are the opportunities and challenges and issues that counties see from this influx of funding that we're going to see as the result of SB1. And I think we'd be remiss to not start out talking about the incredibly difficult circumstances that local governments especially have been facing over the last several years. So we're going to talk a little bit about our local streets and roads needs assessment that the League and CSAC and the regions have been doing for about a decade now. But that assessment has identified a $40 billion backlog of deferred maintenance on just our local city streets and roads. So all the questions about, do you have projects, are you ready to proceed? I think there's a resounding yes from cities and counties that we are ready to put people to work and get projects out to bid as soon as the money starts to become available. We've been in a situation where we've had one revenue stream that was stuck at 1990s levels and actually deteriorating in terms of the amount of funding we got because of increasing fuel economy on vehicles. And then we had the only new formula funding that was added on top of that has been incredibly volatile and has cratered over the last several years as gas prices have declined. So we're really at a point prior to the passage of SB1 where counties were down to doing just the bare minimum of emergency maintenance, really not even doing the preventative pavement maintenance and preservation projects that we know we need to do in order to keep up with the needs of our system and to actually reduce our cost in the long term. So we're very excited to have this new funding, and like others who've spoken already today, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to just tear off of existing processes that we have while also looking at opportunities to really show taxpayers and voters the value that SB1 is providing to them. So I want to talk a little bit about what we already do in terms of our formula funding that we get from the existing gas tax and how that's going to tie in to SB1. So counties already adopt budgets in a public process with a public hearing. And that includes adoption of capital improvement plans that outline the projects that we're going to do in our public works divisions. We're already subject to audit by the state controller's office for the use of the funding that comes to us from the existing gas tax. So there's a very comprehensive report that includes data from all 540 local jurisdictions that's published every year. And that report does a good job at a few things. You know, if you wanted to look up and see what the county of Butte spent on streetlight maintenance last year, you could do that. You could see all the dollars that were allocated to engineering expenses or to acquisition of right-of-way. But the thing that that report doesn't do a great job of is communicating in terms that, the layperson who's interested in knowing how their gas tax is being spent, that they can understand in terms of the projects and the benefits to their local community. So SB1, through the new reporting requirements that are included for the road maintenance and rehabilitation funds, really gives us an opportunity to demonstrate in a very clear and comprehensive way what we're getting with this new funding stream. Finally, for California's 58 counties, we're relying on our pavement management systems to tell us essentially what's the most cost-effective way to allocate transportation funding that we get. So we can look at the data that we have about the pavement condition index on all of our roads and find the most cost-effective way of spending money. So what we've been advising counties to do is essentially take this road maintenance and rehabilitation account money and use it to run your pavement management programs, your asset management systems, in a robust way that you haven't been able to do over the last several years as the gas tax has been cratering. So I think I'll repeat a little bit what others have said in terms of we don't want to duplicate these existing processes. We think we can fold in the adoption of lists into our existing budget process. We think there's already going to be sufficient oversight to make sure we're putting the money in the right pots and making sure we're spending it on the right types of activities. But what really is missing is sort of that comprehensive layperson perspective. Here are the projects that we built with the taxes that came in from SB1. And to have that opportunity to address these massive backlogs of maintenance that we have to have at the local level is great, and it's something that I know counties are very thankful to the governor and legislature and others who have given us the opportunity to really turn the tides and start chipping away at that massive backlog.
Great. Thank you, Chris. How about you, Ronnie? You ready?
Sure. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Ronnie Bruegel here on behalf of the League of California Cities. We represent nearly 500 cities throughout the state of California. In addition to lobbying on transportation issues for the League, I also handle public works and communications issues for the League as well. Coming into this panel, I was asked to share our perspective on what the key provisions are in Senate Bill 1 as it relates to accountability, funding, and reporting as they should be addressed in the Commission's program guidelines. But before I get into that, I wanted to share just our deep gratitude and appreciation for Governor Brown, Chairman Frazier, Chairman Bell, and the legislative leadership for championing this cause. From the League's perspective, SB1 represents landmark infrastructure legislation that we haven't seen in a generation. For the last 10 years, the League of Cities, along with CSAC and the regions, we've been blowing the whistle about the poor conditions of our local streets and roads. Through our biennial needs assessment report, we've been able to identify an unmet funding need that's larger than the backlog of over $70 billion over the next 10 years. Absent SB1, that backlog would have grown by an additional, or that unmet funding need would have grown by an additional $20 billion in just another 10 years. And essentially, in those 10 years, our roads would have gone from bad to worse, with much of the network seeing systematic failure. Valued at over $160 billion for the local street and road network alone, we can't emphasize enough how much SB1 will help close that funding gap and will deliver significant improvements to our existing transportation network. And then this will get me into the question about SB1's key provisions. Aside from generating the revenue that we need to get to repair our existing system, SB1 comes with key transparency and accountability reforms, which will be key in letting the public know we're responsible with the funds. On transparency, the CTC is in the process of drafting draft project list reporting requirements, which cities will have to provide prior to adopting their city budgets. Providing such a list will help cities identify key projects that need to get done and also help hold cities accountable for appropriate spending of this landmark investment. Using a fix-it-first approach where cities need to achieve good conditions on their road, on their local streets and roads before being able to spend those funds on other transportation projects. In addition, SB1 contains a maintenance of effort requirement, which basically means cities have to spend what they've normally spent on transportation if they want to be recipients of the new funding. This helps ensure cities are providing their fair share for their this critical work and are not relying solely on the new funds from SB1. As for funding, SB1 uses a formula-based approach for cities, a little bit different from the counties, where it's allocated on a per capita basis, so on the size of your population. And this is helpful for two reasons. A, we're already familiar with this approach because this is how funding gets allocated through the existing transportation dollar, through the existing gas tax. And then it also helps provide equitable balance for how those funds get distributed. Finally, in terms of reforms, SB1 was passed, as has been mentioned, with ACA 5, which will place a constitutional amendment on the 2018 ballot, which will constitutionally protect SB1 funds for transportation projects only, for the funds that aren't already protected from existing protections in the Constitution. So, kick it over to you, Keith.
Thank you. Keith Dunn here on behalf of the Self-Help Counties Coalition, now made up of 24 counties who have gone out and passed by a 2/3 vote an initiative to tax themselves to build projects. We like to say in the counties, promises made, promises kept, and I think that is something that we should take to mind when we look at implementing SB1. We have a blueprint of the legislation, and I think that we need to stick to it as closely as possible as we go out and implement that. I'd like to, like everyone else, thank all of our elected officials that did take a leap of faith in some cases to put their name in a yes column and vote for this, including the governor, who became very active, and our chairs of our transportation committees. We also want to recognize the various advocates in this room and those that may be watching online that invested years in moving this forward, sometimes working with their elected boards at a local level or other constituent bases, and really came together. I think it's a good example of what we can do as a community of transportation advocates and Californians when we all have a goal and we work towards it. This was an effort that oftentimes we disagreed on, that took a lot of late night discussions and hard work by many of you that are here in this room representing your various organizations, and I think that you need to be acknowledged for making that push at the end that really helped the governor and the chairs of the transportation committees cross the finish line. But there's a lot of work that went into this effort. Self-help counties, as most of you know, have resources that go and build their expenditure plans, and really keeping the faith of their voting public is what has allowed even our friends from Orange County who are here today to go out and pass 2 measures. They take their role very seriously in delivering projects. We have projects that are ready to go. They're online. We have independent citizen groups that help provide oversight. We have audits. We have partnerships with the federal government. We're really looking at SB1 as a continuation of our partnership with the state and this commission to go out and meet the needs and the programs that have been outlined within SB1. I can't stress enough how important we believe that it is to not reinvent the wheel. We've talked about it a lot, but within this room we have various representative programs that have been successful, that have accountability and are ready to go. I think the charge that we would like to see is to, as I like to say with parenting, you put the guardrails up, you move forward, and you have the guardrails there to keep them on the path. But we really would like to keep it simple, keep it fair, and get the money to work. That from our perspective, I think is the way to really make this a successful program. Is let's not dither and make the guidelines so complicated that we have to hire attorneys to read them to fill out our applications to just apply. Let's keep it simple. That way I can read them and know what they mean. So simple is good, fast is even better. And we'd like to keep the faith of the voters and make sure that we're delivering these projects in a timely fashion. There's, between the cities and counties, self-help counties, other interests, there's lots of projects that I think are going to be ready to go in short order. We look forward to a continued partnership. Like I said, we work very closely with the commission staff and commissioners. We look forward to building upon that partnership and really, as we say, keeping the promise. And really that's the accountability at the end of this process. When we start getting this going, they're going to look and see what we did with that leap of faith. And all of us who are involved in this effort, and you as developing these guidelines, we really have an obligation to make sure that we're meeting that leap of faith and delivering what we've told them we're going to do, not diverting money to other programs that may not have fit in the parameters of SB1, even though they may be great programs. We need to make sure that we're following what was intended. So with that, I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Keith. And you know, you suggest, or you reminded me, three of the biggest advocates for the SB1 and for the effort last 2.5 years for transportation funding were the CSAC and the League and the self-help counties, and we all appreciate very much everything that you guys have done as well. So thank you so much for, along with all the other advocates who've really made this possible and created this opportunity for the commission to do all this work and write guidelines. So thank you very much for all that work. So I want to move into some questions. I'm going to actually just ask each one of you a question, and then after that, I think the commissioners themselves might have some questions that they want to ask if there's time, so I will try to be very quick. As you know, Senate Bill 1 states that it is the intent of the legislature that the Department of Transportation and local governments are held accountable for the efficient investment of public funds to maintain the public highways, streets, and roads, and are accountable to the people through performance goals that are tracked and reported. Chris, you mentioned comprehensive layperson reporting, I think is the way you described it in your presentation. Help us understand what you think that means and how the commission can effectively do that without creating, while balancing the challenge of making sure that the money gets out, quickly and efficiently, and you are able to put it forward in an effective manner.
Right. So I think the bill is very explicit in terms of what's required to be included in those reports. So it's your basic information like where the project is, what it is, what's the useful life of the improvement, and so I think what's the added level of accountability that SB1 provides is going beyond the just reporting of dollars and cents to the controller. That's going to continue, and really adding the consideration of projects. So what I would envision as a key way to promote that accountability was taking those reports that are coming in from all 540 local jurisdictions and putting it in a format. And I'm a map person, so I go towards a map, and we're talking about projects here that have a physical location, and so someone can get online and click on their city and look at all the little pinpoints that describe to them exactly what SB1 funding was using for. So I think the availability of that project level information is going to be incredibly helpful in accountability and showing the results that we're able to achieve through the passage of this bill.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Let's see. So I'll move on to Ronnie. So specific to the Local Streets and Roads program in SB1, are there any challenges you foresee for the newly required process for local streets and roads funding, both in the existing language and the proposed trailer bill language, that we can try to accommodate maybe through our guideline or our process that will make the process work better for cities and counties in the effort to try to be sure that we're not creating impediments that don't need to be there?
Sure. So, and we've had conversations about this before. A lot of our cities kind of look at the reporting requirements in Prop 1B, for example, as kind of a model, and hopefully, the reporting requirements in SB or the guidelines as you start to write them are reflective of kind of some of that ease that cities were able to achieve with the Prop 1B reporting requirements, and maybe modified and more modern, right? As far as challenges, it seems from our cities, the feedback that we've been getting so far, it doesn't seem like it'll be too challenging for them to comply with the reporting requirements as they're spelled out in the bill. Obviously, we're going to look closely and work with the CTC and figure out exactly how those guidelines are established, but it doesn't seem kind of out of the ordinary for our cities. We're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach as those guidelines come out to really give you and your staff a better sense of where those challenges are. But as of right now, as it's spelled out in SB1, it doesn't seem like too difficult to comply with.
That's great to hear. I'm glad we got that on the record. So finally, Keith, you mentioned self-help counties making promises to their voters. Assuming the additional funding, addition of reliable state funding from SB1 makes it easier or helps self-help counties deliver on those promises, in what specific ways might we develop the various competitive programs in the bill to be structured to aid in the fulfillment of those of your member counties being able to deliver those programs?
Make them easy to apply to and applicable to the programs that we're bringing. There's a great list of programs, I'm trying to avoid getting into things here. Having the ability to leverage the local funds, I think, the best way to utilize best SB1 is to utilize and leverage the local funds that you can combine with these. None of these projects, as we've mentioned throughout this panel discussion earlier today, are built with any one source of funding. So really, I think the benefit here is to make sure that we're leveraging the resources that the self-help counties can bring to projects, whether it's through the state-local partnership or other pots of funds that we're looking to build these guidelines to. Again, I get back to keep it simple, make it fair, make it accessible, so that we're not making it a bias for smaller regions or counties. But really the leveraging, the success that you can bring in taking, a dollar of state funds and then combining it with the locals and really making it a play even with federal dollars blended in if we ever do get federal monies again, is a real opportunity to show the voters that you're making the most of what we have. As you heard from my colleagues on the right and the left, the needs are even greater than what we have resources for today. There's still great needs out there. So the ability to leverage dollars, I think, is going to be the best thing that we can do with these SB1 funds moving forward with the locals and even with the feds. So.
Great. Thank you, Keith. So now I'm going to turn it over to the chair. I believe he may have questions or ask the commissioners if they have questions.
What I was going to do is if we ended up with a little bit of 5 or 10 minutes and we kind of open it up, but we're right on time, so we're going to keep moving. If the next panel would move up to the dais and the next moderator take a seat, we'll get right into it.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you. Thanks, Ronnie.
Thank you. Please.
This ought to be a good one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone. Hi, I'm Garth Hopkins with the California Transportation Commission, and I'll be moderating this panel on social equity and environmental perspectives. And first of all, I just wanted to say it's great to see that Adrian, I understand your plane was late, right? So you made it. Yay. Okay, we were kind of thinking we might have to go on without you. But I'll just do a really quick, just a super quick introduction of the folks, the speakers. We've got 5 in the order that they'll be presenting, and then if we have some time, we'll ask some questions. And so first we have Carrie Connect, who's the Director of Climate Plan, and then Erica Rincon-Wincombe, who's a Senior Associate with PolicyLink, Richard Marcantonio, who's a Managing Attorney with Public Advocates, and Adrian Martinez, Staff Attorney with Earth Justice. And lastly, Liz O'Donoghue, who's the Director of Infrastructure with the Nature Conservancy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie.
All right, well, thank you for having me. As he said, I'm Carrie Connect. I'm the Director of Climate Plan, and for those who don't know us, we're a network of over 50 nonprofit organizations throughout the state that have been working for strong implementation of the state's climate laws and working to ensure that they help us build healthier, more sustainable, more equitable regions for people of all incomes around the state. So I'm happy to be here on this exciting occasion on the launch of SB1, and it's Infrastructure Week, I hear, and so I think it's particularly appropriate that we're all here talking about infrastructure, and I think it illustrates the importance of California's leadership that on this week we are actually here launching a very large infrastructure package. So this SB1 is going to fund the infrastructure of the coming decade. It's going to shape the future that all of our children, that future generations live in. And so with that, I wanted to start my remarks by thinking about some of the state goals that I believe this funding should help us achieve. So the first goal is that it should help us achieve our climate goals. The Air Resources Board latest draft of the scoping plan acknowledges that a gap remains between the greenhouse gas reductions that can now be attained from household driving and the reductions that are needed to meet state climate goals. They estimate that these goals could be met if, on average, every person drove just 1.6 fewer miles per day, which feels like it should be eminently attainable, and yet we are falling short. Closely related, air quality remains a significant challenge. The American Lung Association has found that that some of the most polluted communities in the country are found in California. Over 90% of Californians live in a county that experiences unhealthy air, and the largest share of these pollutants come from transportation sources. So as we think about building infrastructure, we can think about how we can ameliorate this problem. Critical to hitting both of those goals are the targets for reduced driving and shift to alternative modes of travel. So Caltrans's strategic management plan for 2015 to 2020 set a goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled by 15% per capita statewide relative to 2010 levels, to triple biking, to double walking, and to double transit mode share. So the state seems currently at risk of missing these targets. So these are I'm just beginning to go through these, but what I see is a trend of us having very important and very ambitious goals, now having a substantial pot of funding and being at risk of missing those goals and needing to be very deliberate about how we achieve that. As I continue with the goals, it's also essential that these funds meet important community needs. As you'll hear from Richard and Erica and others, the SB1's intent language talks about directing investments to the state's highest transportation needs, and to me that means the needs of the most disadvantaged communities, to folks that are isolated or do not have other means of transportation, and even the communities that currently lack important civic infrastructure like sidewalks or drinking water. We heard earlier from Director Metcalf about the state's urgent housing crisis, that we're currently building only under half of the housing needs every year. And as a result, homelessness has surged and residents are being displaced. And this is not only tearing up communities, but it is also adding to some of the transportation challenges that we're experiencing. One recent study found that a new worker in San Francisco of the highest income tier compared to the lowest income tier, the worker in the lowest income tier would have to travel 4.4 times as far. So if you think about it, tripling, quadrupling commutes and the transportation impacts of this, then it becomes apparent that we have to find ways to knit these pieces together. And last but not least in the goals list is we need to have this help build sustainable regions that are resilient to a changing climate. So Liz will talk about a number of strategies for us to do that. Trying to keep an eye on time here. So I wanted to offer just a few quick thoughts about how to get there. First, we have to ensure accountability and meeting the highest needs, and in order to do that, we will need an inclusive process with strong and transparent criteria for these funding sources. Second, we know that we do not have enough funding. We heard from Chair Alvarado about how this is just a down payment, so we need to direct these funds to the planning and to the projects that do the most to achieve these goals. Third, where formulas are used, the minimum requirements should serve as those guide rails we were just hearing about to help us know that we're staying on track to achieve these goals. So where there are formulas, there need to be strong minimum requirements. We need for the criteria to help push us beyond sort of the planning that we all habitually fall into. And in particular, we see the local planning grants program as one opportunity. With one round of SB 375 planning behind us, we actually interviewed dozens of people around the state about leading practices in the development of sustainable community strategies and regional transportation plans. And you find amazing innovation and excellent practices that go beyond sort of the minimum in the law, and we believe that programs like that can help fund efforts like that. Last, we should be using this to fund integrated goals and solutions that achieve multiple benefits, and think about how the pieces that fit together. So for example, the Congested Corridor Program, one of the criteria is efficient land use. And if we start to think about how we can connect the dots between land use, the multi-modes of transportation, affordability, and conservation, by knitting all of those pieces together, we can use this money to achieve the California of the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. Erica?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Rincon-Whitcomb. I'm here on behalf of PolicyLink. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute dedicated to advancing equity for low-income communities and communities of color. And I wanted to first just start off with the definition of equity so that we all understand what we mean when we say this. So equity means promoting fair and just inclusion throughout society and creating the conditions in which everyone can participate, prosper, and reach his or her full potential. I think that's important to acknowledge so that we can think about what does that mean then for SB 1 implementation. So obviously we know that transportation plays a very powerful and important role in creating healthy communities of opportunity. How we allocate our transportation resources, obviously determines whether or not everyone is able to safely and reliably access the critical amenities and resources that they need to lead healthy, productive lives. And this is particularly important in California, where we are a state that is majority people of color at 60% of the population. We also have close to half the state's population living in a low-income area. So for many folks, they aren't able to access healthy communities, and they're not able to access opportunity. And I think it's important for us to get a sense of how they experience transportation barriers and disadvantages. So we know that there's places in California where there are school children, young children who have to wait on alongside very dangerous shoulders of highways in order to catch their bus, where they don't have bus shelters, where they don't have sufficient protection for them against the high-speed traffic that's going by. We also know that there's disadvantaged unincorporated communities that don't have a single paved road, that have enormous potholes and ditches to the extent where when it rains, it floods extensively and people can't leave their homes, and they lack the adequate infrastructure to address this. We also hear stories of family members that have to wake up at 3 a.m. to take the 5 buses that it's going to take to get to their jobs by 6 a.m. because where they live, they don't have adequate transit service that can efficiently and more directly connect them to where they have to go every single day. But I think with SB 1, this actually represents an opportunity for us to really be intentional about addressing some of these transportation inequities and really start to shift to prioritize and think in a very intentional way about the mobility and safety needs of these folks. And in order to be intentional, it goes beyond just the language and the rhetoric, but it's actually about putting money behind those priorities and carving out investments and targeting them to the highest need areas. And set aside policies and targeting money to low-income communities and disadvantaged communities isn't something new. We've seen this in a number of programs, including the Active Transportation Program and a number of infrastructure programs, and it's been done very well. But in order to really be successful at this approach, we have to be thinking about how are we going to achieve meaningful benefits. And obviously, in order to really achieve those, we have to go directly to the community themselves to surface their transportation needs and the best solutions to meet these needs. And that is, that's going to require us to kind of re-envision and rethink how we go about our traditional public participation and community engagement efforts to ensure that we are providing for meetings that are, accessible to folks who have historically and currently face multiple barriers to being able to participate in the types of transportation planning processes that carry, huge impacts on their lives. And then the last piece I just wanted to mention is around the economic impact of SB1 and the opportunity that is there. So there is intent language in the bill that emphasizes the goal of ensuring a fair distribution of the economic impact of SB1. And the way to really get at that, to not only achieve that, but to go beyond that and maximize the economic impact, is that we have to think about how are we going to ensure that the families out there and the individuals who are experiencing the highest levels of poverty and unemployment, how are we going to ensure that they're able to access the significant number of good jobs that are going to be created from these investments? SB1 does a great job of putting in money for workforce training so that we can make sure we have a workforce that is prepared to take on the jobs, and we can take that further by actually targeting jobs and making sure that the highest need folks have access to these opportunities, not only to generate greater economic security for themselves, but to strengthen and grow our local economies. And I just wanted to end with a quote from the scholar Robert Bullard, who used to say, "Follow the transportation dollars and one can tell who is important and who is not." And I think that SB1 is an opportunity for us to actually counter this statement and to say, this isn't going to reflect how we do things in California, that going forward we aren't going to invest in that way, but that we are going to start to take steps to change the paradigm, to create a more equitable system, because ultimately, to the extent that we can provide meaningful benefits for the most vulnerable folks, for the people who are hardest to reach, that will ultimately be a measure of how successful we can be as a state as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Erica. Richard?
Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Susan. My name is Richard Marcantonio, and I'm a managing attorney at Public Advocates, and I'm very happy to be here. I also serve under Jim Medafra's great leadership on the Road Charge Technical Advisory Committee. And Carl, I'm afraid you're going to be bored by hearing again what I said in San Jose. But you know, I want to frame it around again, building on the intent language in the bill itself, where it says, as Carrie mentioned, that the revenue should be directed to the state's highest transportation needs. And there are two really important things in here. I'm going to mention one and then delve into the other. The first is that, you know, when we talk about shovel-ready projects and lists of projects, what about the needs assessment? Too often, I think our local, our regional agencies are rushing ahead with what's in the pipeline without assessing what are the greatest needs, and needs change over time. So that's one point. But what I really want to get into is the importance, and go a little further on Erica's point, that the needs of underserved communities, of low-income communities and communities of color, their greatest needs are included in that intent language. So I want to talk about the relationship between community needs and what many of us refer to as transportation justice. And specifically, how will the Commission ensure that SB1's revenues are invested to meet the priority needs identified by those communities? I want to frame out the two broad kinds of impacts that transportation has, and Adrian's going to pick up on this framing as well. It's an environmental justice framing about benefits and burdens. The benefits of transportation spending are mobility, right? Are things like bus service and that provides access to opportunity and economic mobility. And of course, jobs is another thing on the benefit ledger. On the burden side, transportation, two of the biggest ones here in California are air quality burdens that Adrian's going to talk more about, and actually displacement burdens. The development that transportation investment catalyzes can be beneficial to a community or can be harmful to a community. So how are we going to make sure that what I'll just say about the transportation justice framing is that what we find over and over again historically and unfortunately into the present is that the benefits are being skewed away from underserved communities, and the burdens are falling on them disproportionately. So implementing SB1 from that perspective really requires attention to how the money is fairly meeting the benefit, fairly sharing the benefits and the burdens that the investments are creating. And I want to talk about, Erica mentioned the active transportation program as having been a good example of this. Another great example is the Air Resources Board's implementation in the context of our cap and trade revenues of SB 535, which requires 25%, and now it's actually 35% of the revenues to benefit disadvantaged and low-income communities. And the Air Resources Board put in place a set of funding guidelines that have incorporated a number of points from a framework that we and some of our partners have developed. And the framework asks 5 questions, and I'll start with the last 4, but then I really want to emphasize the first one. The framework asks, does the investment provide significant benefits to the disadvantaged community? Are the benefits targeted to lower income residents? Does the investment avoid harming the community? And then a 5th one that doesn't come up in the cap and trade context, but does in transportation in connection with long-range planning is, are the benefits front-loaded? Are they coming early in the plan, in the 25-year plan, or are they coming in the distant future? But the first question is the one I want to focus on because it brings us back to the language about meeting the most important needs in SB1, and that is, does the investment meet an important need that the residents of the community themselves have identified and prioritized? And I think this really offers an important direction for equity and social justice in the implementation of SB1, because what do you need to do? You don't need to run sophisticated computer models. You don't need to do equity analyses on the projects in the pipelines. Like, that's not going to answer the question. You do need to do that, sorry, but that's not going to answer the question. What you do need to do is talk to the experts about what these needs are and how they can best be met, which are the residents of the communities. So one great example of that, and I won't say too much about it, but the Air Resources Board just in implementing a provision of SB 350 did a draft report on the barriers that low-income residents face to accessing clean transportation options. And as I understand it, for over a year, they conducted extensive outreach and public engagement, which included community-based meetings with low-income residents across the state. And if they can do that to come up with a draft report, or it'll be a final report, but a study, essentially, then I think it's all the more incumbent on us in implementing guidelines that are going to drive the expenditure of billions of dollars to make sure that those communities have a real voice in the process. The other model that I want to mention is participatory budgeting, which some of you in your local jurisdictions may be familiar with. It's a model of democratic decision-making around the needs and the priorities, developing a range of projects that can meet those needs, and then actually voting on them. So, in the end, a fair share of transportation funding has to be set aside to meet the needs of these communities, and I think that's the ultimate test of whether the intent of SB1 is fulfilled. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Adrian?
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Martinez, and I'm a staff attorney with Earth Justice. Earth Justice is a nonprofit environmental law firm. We have basically 3 locations in California, an office in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and an office here in Sacramento. So I'm an attorney by trade, so I kind of get involved in transportation projects. Often, I'll just state this, you know, a lot of people have been accused, all you want to do is sue over transportation projects and that's all you do. I assure you that suing over a transportation project is about as pleasurable for me as a root canal. It's like, you know, right up there. So my goal is to figure out how can we move forward and address some of the systemic issues that are facing communities and clients and coalition partners we work with. I'm going to particularly focus on freight. That's what we spend a lot of our time. Freight pollution and freight projects are kind of a big deal in Southern California, but they're a big deal throughout California. And I want to start with one premise. It's often asked which came first, the community or the freight facility. And I want to just state that that is the wrong question to ask. There's been decisions from the top of California, the governor, down to the local level, that California is going to be a freight state. We're going to move a lot of freight. Even if we stay at existing levels, there's goals to expand it. There's a lot of freight, and with that comes a lot of community impacts. Now, I want to make clear, we understand that there are economic benefits of the freight industry, and you know, I don't want to debate that. That's that's been decided. The state's moving forward. But I want to address one issue that often comes up with these freight projects. Is in the freight realm, one of the big desirable goals is to increase efficiency. How do you move more boxes through the region faster to get to their ultimate destination? And often there's some tension because when cities or regions promote these freight projects that increase efficiency, they're surprised when community groups don't, throw a parade or, get excited. And it's not that efficiency isn't important. If that's a laudable goal to increase the efficiency of the amount of cargo moving through California. But I want to be clear that that doesn't address some of the systemic issues that the freight industry poses on communities. Because especially how the models are done in Southern California, the presumption is if you move more cargo, it's going to mean there's additional cargo behind it. And there's a lot of quibbling about how much cargo is going to get diverted, and those types of issues. But I think when you kind of really look at this issue, the groups, the environmental groups and the community groups that are working on these projects, they're more interested in the outcomes, which is how do you improve the quality of life? How do you reduce emissions in community? How do you reduce emissions in the region? And how do you address quality of life issues, noise, light, and other issues like that related to the freight industry? Now, the good news is there's a lot of overlap with what a lot of community groups and environmental groups are pushing, especially down in Southern California, is that, technology is a key part of the solution. And I think the freight industry is particularly dynamic now. There's a lot of changes going on. And I think what you see people pushing are how do we create the freight industry of modern times? And one of the issues that's getting a lot of attention is how do we integrate zero emissions into the freight industry? And I think you can view the transportation system as a very important part of it, because part of it's the vehicles, but part of it's the infrastructure. You've got a lot of grassroots community support for zero emissions, and people are calling for it, and it's going to require everyone in this room to kind of figure out how do we achieve that mission. And this isn't a decision that's 4, 5, 6, 10 years down. These are decisions that should be made this year, next year, and soon, because we need the relief that comes with these zero emission technologies. One thing I want to just highlight, sometimes projects are related to freight, and sometimes they're freight and kind of how people get around their communities. So I want to just highlight some of the work that's been going around the 710 project in Southern California. That is an instance where community groups rolled up their sleeves, hired experts, worked with the community to develop a preferred alternative to say, how can we allow the expansion of the 710 to happen to allow freight to move and address really deeply rooted community concerns? And sometimes in that process it's been viewed as adversarial, but I think we should kind of shift shift the way we think of that. That needs to be applauded, and we need to have that type of engagement. And I think it's a unique opportunity that transportation planners and agencies need to, take communities up on. If they're willing to spend thousands and thousands of hours to really dig in and figure out how to make this project work, I think it should be celebrated, and we need to foster that type of work. So I think I'm at 6 minutes now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And then our last speaker is Liz O'Donoghue.
Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Susan. It's great to go last because it's great to hear the benefit of my co-speakers. I'm Liz O'Donoghue, by the way, with the Nature Conservancy. And first, a few things. I think there's a number of common threads among us. One is that this is really a historic package, as we've been talking about. And with that comes an opportunity for change and innovation. And we've been hearing this morning or this afternoon about it's really important to get this going. We need to have quick investments. We need to be right out of the gate, and I totally get that, and we support that. But I think it's really important that we don't lose sight that we need to get this right. So $52 billion over 10 years. Transportation has dramatic impacts on and influence on communities and how we live our everyday lives. And so I think we should, it's been really great to hear everybody speak, but I think we should really think about some of the common threads. One is that transportation investments in the last couple years, we've really seen a shift throughout the country, really, and California has been part of that, to really focus investments on multiple outcomes. So it's not just mobility as we used to think about mobility, but it's not only mobility, it's connectivity for communities. It's focusing on benefits to the most vulnerable populations. It's preserving our natural resources and our habitat and wildlife and agricultural lands. It's our health goals. It's really knowing that transportation has such influence on our community character. How do we bring the voices of the communities to the front, both in the urbanizing environment, in the urban core, in the suburban environment, and the wildlands and the rural communities are really important throughout. So a lot of what I was going to say, my co-speakers have already said, so I'm not going to really talk about that. But I wanted to just highlight a couple things. Achieving these outcomes won't just happen because the bill was passed. Now the hard work is really done. It has to be before us. And so we have to really focus these guidelines on providing specific guidance, not just to Caltrans, but to all the communities and the transportation agencies to make good on the promise and the intent goals that Richard talked about, as well as the environmental goals and the mobility and economic goals in the bill. So I want to just highlight three provisions or three topics. One is, I was very delighted to see that in SB 1, there was a focus on climate resilience and adaptation, both in VMT reduction and greenhouse gas goals, greenhouse gas emission goals, but also in the planning grants, in the climate resilient planning grants, and also the provision requiring climate resilient features. So I want to offer a couple things. We should really take an innovative, long-term, and expansive view of what that can include, and there's a lot of guidance out there from Federal Highways, if they haven't taken it down already off their website, on climate resilient transportation systems. But let's plan for the long term. Let's look at 2050 and 2100. What is the environment going to be like? What is the world going to be like then? And is our transportation system designed to withstand and be resilient to that environment? Second, let's choose solutions that result in multiple benefit and outcomes, which includes prioritizing natural infrastructure to help reduce the impacts of climate change and make the system more resilient. We've been working with ABAG and TAMC and Caltrans on a project in Elkhorn Slough to look at Highway 1 and think of solutions that allow for both making the system more resilient to climate change in a way that also protects the habitat. So I have some examples, but I was just told I'm out of time. So one more point on that. There is a big loophole in the law with that provision about climate components. One is, it says, if feasible, if it looks good, if it feels good. It's a big language. Let's be really specific to encourage the likelihood of success and reduce the ability to say no. Two more points. One is performance criteria. Let's really embrace this multiple benefit outcome and make sure that the performance criteria reflects those goals that we want to see, the health goals, the equity goals, active transportation goals, habitat, open space. Finally, my favorite thing is the advanced mitigation program, something we've been working on for a long time. I saw Gary Gallegos here, I don't know if he's still here, and Daryl Johnson, those agencies have been doing advanced mitigation for a long time. The Bay Area is very invested in it, is about to be invested in it. I'm really excited to see how can we really make that happen in a way that's efficient, effective, and meets these multiple goals of project delivery and conservation outcome. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I just want to say it's really interesting. I think some really good perspectives from this panel. Learned a new term, transportation justice, for myself at least. So I had some questions. Unfortunately, I think due to the time constraints, we're not going to be able to do that. I don't turn it over to the chair if.
We're pretty much out of time, so we need to start. Day. Tomorrow will be the question and kind of getting in the weeds day. So we'll hopefully you'll all be back tomorrow, and we'll go from there. Thank you. Thank you very much. If the next panel could kind of make their way to the front, please. Okay, let's get right into it.
Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Vandermolen. I'm Deputy Director for the Commission, mostly in charge of the Road Charge Pilot Program recommendations. Welcome. This is the Business and Industry Perspective Panel. Transportation is the backbone of our social and economic lives, and SB 1 heralds a much-needed investment in California's transportation infrastructure. Not only do we use roads and rails to move goods to market, working, shopping, acquiring goods from the stores is just a portion of the need for adequate and well-maintained infrastructure. Transportation also sits at the core of our personal lives and family lives and gives us the ability to visit with distant relatives, get our kids to school, go on vacations, and make sure our tourism industry is vital and revitalized and working well. And for good quality of life, we need adequate and accessible transportation. Business and industry benefit from shorter commute times, less frustrated employees, happy and connected families, and also the assurance that they can reliably and quickly get transportation for their goods to market. These panelists will talk about SB 1 perspectives from the business and industry leaders. We have with us today Stephen Finnegan, who's Manager of Government and Community Affairs for the Automobile Club of California and also does a significant amount of work for AAA. He leads government affairs, community relations, traffic safety, advocacy, and public policy. And we also have Michael Quigley, who's the Executive Director of the California Alliance for Jobs. His very broad portfolio covers legislative, political, and regulatory issues. He's worked on many statewide ballot initiatives related to transportation as well as local transportation tax measures. So for these gentlemen, please take away the business perspective, and if you could, among that, talk about how SB1 program guidelines should consider and support economic growth.
I think I'll go ahead and start first. Thank you very much, Curtis. I appreciate the introduction. I think you said you said most of the key sentiments in your introduction, I think. I am Steve Finnegan with the Auto Club of Southern California. I would like to thank the California Transportation Commission for inviting me to be part of this forum. I know we're running short on time, so what I'd like to do is three things relatively briefly. I would like to provide a little bit of information about the Auto Club and our role in these issues to sort of set the stage for my comments. I would then like to share three words that have guided our advocacy over the last handful of years, and I think they're relevant to SB1 implementation. And then I want to leave you with 5 recommendations. The Auto Club was founded 117 years ago in Los Angeles. We now operate the AAA clubs in 21 states. California actually has 2 AAA clubs, Auto Club of Southern California and AAA Northern California. We have 7 million members in Southern California, almost 12 million members throughout the state. As a business, we have 7,000 employees in Southern California operating out of 82 branch offices, handling about 7 million walk-in visits per year. And we also have 4 call centers in the state that handle over 12 million calls per year. When we were founded in 1900, one of the core purposes for our founding was to improve roads, transportation, and traffic safety. We carry that mission through to today. We have been involved in every county transportation sales tax measure in Southern California. We've supported almost all of them. We supported Proposition 42, the ballot measure that brought the sales tax on gasoline to transportation. We supported multiple measures to protect transportation funds, and we supported Proposition 1B, the $20 billion bond measure. In the last few years, we have used 3 priorities or 3 words for our advocacy. And I want to go through those because I think they're relevant to SB1. Those 3 words are improve, protect, and increase. And by improve, I mean improve how the funds are being used. Make sure that money is directed to the most effective projects, those capable of addressing congestion, those that can expand mobility, and those that can improve traffic safety. How can we improve the efficiency of the processes that we're all talking about today and the agencies that are delivering the transportation projects? How can we include the private sector more to reduce costs and reduce timelines? How can we make sure that the money that's going to go into maintenance is able to bring down costs over the long term for roads and other transportation services and projects? And how do we make sure that we use the best materials and technologies? The second word is protect. And by protect, what I mean is making sure that transportation funds are actually used for transportation. Unfortunately, California has a history of diverting transportation funds away to other uses when things have gotten tough. That cannot go and continue into the future. And we do think that there was a missed opportunity in SB1 to redirect the general fund to make payments for the Proposition 1B bonds that were promised to voters. And then the third word is increase. And by that we mean increased transportation funding. That's been accomplished with SB1. Let me go forward, or I should say going forward, we really have 5 recommendations that I want to convey to the Commission. One is to deliver on the promises. Deliver on the promises that were made in the legislative debate, deliver on the promises that were made in press conferences to the public, deliver on the promise to improve road conditions, use funds well, and not to divert the funds. Our second recommendation is to deliver on better mobility. Although repairing roads is a central part of all of this, we need to address the other big issue that Californians want, and that is they want congestion addressed in some way. There are going to be a lot of strategies to do this going forward. Amongst those strategies, increasing road capacity has to be included. This is vitally important for the goods movement industry. That is important to the state's economy. And we need to make sure that all of the projects that are included in the local county transportation sales tax measures are implemented. You know, we heard earlier, promises made, promises kept. Those promises have been made. The promises need to be kept going forward. The third recommendation we have is to deliver on safety. While we're rebuilding our roads, we have an opportunity to make changes to reduce crashes. Last month, the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety came out with a report that looked out across the entire country over a 20-year time period, and they found that if a handful of items were done consistently across the country, 63,000 lives could be saved over that time period. These include adding roundabouts in place of regular intersections where appropriate, adding roadside improvements like installing more barriers and removing objects that can be struck by vehicles, improving sidewalks and adding more signalized pedestrian crossings, adding rumble strips to center lines and shoulders where they don't exist now, and paving and widening shoulders where possible. Our fourth recommendation is to proceed cautiously on other funding options. I have the pleasure of serving under Commissioner Medaffer on the Road Charge Technical Advisory Committee. It's important work that we're doing. A report's going to be coming to the Commission. A report's going to be going to the legislature. More work needs to be done, and I wouldn't want to see a rush to premature implementation. And the last recommendation, I think, ties into the comments in the last panel quite a bit, is to continue and to improve communication. We need to make sure that we're incorporating the sentiments of the broader California communities, not just the people that attend meetings, not just the voices we hear most often or loudest, but the broader desires of all of California, which I think includes better roads, reduced congestion, and improved safety. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer any questions if we have time for it.
Thank you. My name is Michael Quigley, Executive Director with the California Alliance for Jobs. The Alliance for Jobs is a labor management partnership representing 2,000 union construction contractors and roughly 80,000 union construction workers, the men and women who build and maintain our state's infrastructure. And the Alliance has been involved in many of the political fights over the last 2 decades that have involved major political heavy lifts around transportation and infrastructure investments. We are involved in the water bond, high-speed rail, 2006 bonds, and then most recently, we're one of the key groups as part of the Fix Our Roads Coalition, along with the League of Cities and CSAC, who was really advocating for the SB1's passage and really trying to create the groundswell of support that ultimately we were able to do successfully with the help of the people in this room. So thank you all. This was a great victory for all of us, and now we got to figure out, it's kind of like the scene at the end of The Candidate with Robert Redford. You've seen that movie, he wins the election and says, okay, now what? This is a great opportunity for all of us, as we've been discussing today, and for on the construction industry, we're looking at, it's really sort of, this has been a strategic objective for us for such a long time, and it's been such a long, ongoing effort that we are now in our own bit of a reset about how are we going to prioritize transportation for the next few years before we do end up moving into eventually a new system that's not a gas tax based. So in the near future, the things that the industry is really looking at predominantly have to do with 3 areas. Accountability for the programming of the funds, which we've heard many people talk about today, and I think that's one of the things that there seems to be a great deal of consensus around amongst all the stakeholders, is that we have done something that needs to be allocated as we intended it to. And that's both a promise we've made to the public, but also it's necessary for the policy objectives that we all want to see happen. So I think that accountability piece is very important. And then the project delivery aspect. I'm really pleased to hear a lot of discussion at the local and state level about streamlining project delivery, accelerating, moving funds up to fund projects this year that are then going to get backfilled. Those are all good things in my mind in terms of presenting a case for why this tax increase that we've now placed upon the state is going to actually have a much greater benefit and much more positive impacts than what the opponents are out saying right now. And so the quicker we can get those projects on the street, the better it's going to be for those of us who are in the transportation space in terms of communicating about the benefits of SB1. And the other elements of the project accountability and delivery that we're looking at, SCA 5, which is the accompanying companion measure. We haven't talked about that yet today, but that's a key element. It is highly popular with the voters, and it needs to be passed. You know, this is a key component. As during the fight for SB1, we wanted to talk about the accountability measures on equal footing with the revenue measures, and in part because the history of raids on transportation funding have made this a necessary policy vehicle to make sure that we have the lockbox that's required to deliver on these projects. And then also, it's one of the most statient political arguments for the public is that you're being taxed, but it's directed exclusively towards this purpose. And that is really what helped sell this with the public, was the accountability provisions. So that measure is going to be up on the June of 18 ballot. And expect that we'll be hearing more about that. You know, we're going to be doing some research in the second half of this year and really gearing up starting in January to pass that SCA 5 constitutional protections measure and lock in these funds for perpetuity. Another thing that we're focused on is CTC empowerment. Many of you may have seen the LAO report today. Some of the recommendations that came out of there in terms of giving the CTC more accountability and oversight, including maybe potentially giving the CTC individual project authority. You know, I think these are all positive things in advancing an accountability agenda and making sure that we're holding up our promise to the voters. And then lastly, you know, project tracking and messaging that to the public. You know, having a element of accountability it's transparent, and then also communicating that on the ground. The local agencies generally have done a better job about tying in their local sales tax measure money to an individual projects through signage and things like that. And so there's already discussions going on with Caltrans and the League of Cities and at the regional level as well about having some sort of messaging at the project level that ties the funding of or SB1 resources to this actual projects on the street, so that when your voters are going around their communities, they're seeing, oh, hey, that's where my money went. Okay, I'm good with that, rather than just thinking it went into the nebulous black hole of Sacramento. So making sure that there's a local accountability piece and treating this money as funding local projects and communicating that to the public is very important. And then finally, the last point that our industry is really going to be shifting towards has to do with workforce development. For the construction industry, you know, this has been this is going to mean, you know, roughly $5 billion expansion of our entire industry going forward. You know, we talk about this in terms of $52 billion, but this money's for perpetuity, and then starting in 2020, there'll be an escalator based off inflation. So really, the money we're talking about in the 10-year frame is more than $52 billion, and then when you look at it for perpetuity, you know, we're talking really something that has an even higher number than that. And I think it's important to look at what the job impact of that is going to be. Unlike past transportation expenditures that may be one-time project-based, this is ongoing money. So this is not looked, I don't think this money should be looked at in the same context as like a development project or some big mega infrastructure project. This is an opportunity to create careers in construction, because these projects aren't going to go away. This is an annual basis. So people who move into apprenticeship programs at the start of SB1 will potentially have this job for the rest of their lives, the rest of their careers. So I think it's important to think about this not in the terms of what are the job benefits, but what are the career benefits. And you know, we have an industry in construction where the average age of a worker is approaching 50 years old. You know, so there's a huge opportunity for millennials to get into these jobs, and these are really good family supporting middle class jobs with full health care, pension, and security. And there's not a lot of opportunities like that left in California. And so I think that's one of the key elements of the messaging about what this really means for the state. The workforce development aspect is going to mean that we're going to have to get 60,000 plus new construction workers and on an annual basis, you know, to fill the need of what SB1 is going to bring. And that's just in the direct job employment, you know, guys on the line. There's going to be a huge expansion of associated industry whether that's in the materials side, the engineering side, the design. All of these other associated aspects of construction are also going to expand. And so there's going to be really a growth in an entire economic sector that I think we should think about as a huge opportunity, and how we present that to the public is part of the overall story and the narrative and the value of SB1. And I think that becomes a key part of our messaging going forward. You know, an apprenticeship program takes roughly 4,500 hours of classroom and on-the-job training to move from an apprentice to a journeyman. Now, that's roughly equivalent to a 4-year degree. And so these are careers that we've now created through the passage of this legislation that are going to affect, you know, millions of Californians in a positive way economically, and allow people who might otherwise not have such great economic opportunity to move into the middle class and have a secure life. And I think we got to look at this in the context of that, and not just think about this as we have in the past as terms of a CBA or a one-off job agreement. That's not the right way, because this is an ongoing thing, and there'll be a lot bigger benefits down the road by changing people's lives and the trajectory of their lives, rather than just giving them a job for the duration of a project. So that's pretty much what I got, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Stevens. Thank you, Michael. Chairman Alvarado, did you have questions for the panel? And Commissioner Guardino, anything from you? Thank you very much.
Going into, we're on time again, that's pretty good. Going into the public comment side, I'd like to open it up if there are any comments from the commissioner. No comments? Are there any comments from the public? Susan, you want to wrap it up?
Okay. All right. Well, before we completely wrap this up, I wanted to wait until the end so you could hear, what, at least for the commission, that we'll be working on. And with that, I just want to take this opportunity to ask my staff to please stand up that's here. Got a lot of staff here. This is, the commission is a small organization, but this is the team. There's a couple others that are not here, but I just want, you guys can sit down, but I just wanted you to see who's our team, and I just really want to express my appreciation to all of them. They are stepping up right now. We do not have new staff at this point, and they've all come together as a team, and I just wanted to share that right now. And I know tomorrow, hopefully most of you or all of you will be at our workshop tomorrow, where it's really where we're starting to put, the pen to the paper. But, this is a team that has just really works together and has just come together, and I haven't heard one thing about the increased workload at all. Just a real spirit of collaboration and recognizing the importance of this bill and these programs and what these programs are going to do for California. So I just wanted to thank them and thank them for helping us arrange this, bringing this event together today and for tomorrow, and want to talk with you about the work groups that are going to be forming and the guideline development process. So with that, thank you. Yeah, this is a great team here. With that, on the slide, you'll see a email address where you can send in if you're interested, those of you that are remote, if you want to participate on a panel or on a workshop, in a work group. And also, just if you have general questions about Senate Bill 1 and what the commission is doing. And I think that's really it. Tomorrow the workshop starts at 8:30 a.m. here in this room, and it will be, just to give you a little preview, it will be those staff that you just saw stand up here today really leading through each of the various programs, what the statutory requirements are for those programs, and seeking input. Today, as Chair Alvarado mentioned, it was about listening to our leaders in different aspects of the industry and the state and the local level and environmental justice communities, cities and counties, but tomorrow it's really about hearing from you, while we will have you will hear from our staff as well. But thank you again so much for being here today, and for those of you viewing, we appreciate it, and we look forward to working with you moving forward. Thank you.
We want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll see everybody at 8:30 tomorrow.